Hello there. Come in out of the wind and sit yourself down. Pull the chair closer to the hearth. The draught in this old house has a way of finding the marrow of your bones if you give it half a chance. You've arrived at the right time for a bit of a yarn, though I should warn you, tonight's story isn't about ghosts in the usual sense. There are no rattling chains to keep you awake, no pale whispers at the bedroom door, and no cold fingers brushing against your neck in the dark. This one's about something much quieter than that, and perhaps in its own way, something a bit heavier. It's about the weight of being looked at and dismissed. It's about what it feels like to carry more than a person should have to carry at an age when your hands are still small and your heart is still expecting the world to be fair. Most of all, it's about what can happen when something the world has already given up on, something cast aside as broken or useless, decides for one brief, thundering moment to prove it was never what they said it was. This took place in County Meath, not far from the Hill of Tara, in the early years of a new century that hadn't yet decided what sort of world it wanted to be. The old ways were still rooted deep in the soil, even as the smoke of progress began to smudge the horizon. The day began the same way it always did for Betty Langan. Before the light had properly settled over the fields, and long before the crows had gathered themselves into their usual raucous arguments atop the skeletal limbs of the ash trees, Betty was already outside. The air was a thick, silver grey, smelling of damp earth and the sharp, metallic promise of rain. She had a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, pinned at her breast with a rusted brooch, though the morning carried a persistent dampness that crept through the cloth all the same. The yard was quiet, held in that peculiar, breathless hush of the pre-dawn hours, apart from the slow, rhythmic shifting of the hen coop near the low stone wall and the soft scrape of a wooden bucket being dragged across the packed, uneven earth of the yard. "Come on now," she said under her breath. Her voice was a mere rasp against the cold, intended more for herself than anything else. The dog at her heels, a lean, wiry thing named Luna, lifted its ears all the same. Luna stayed close as Betty worked, circling once or twice with a watchful, intelligent gait before settling into the one dry patch of stone near the back step. The doggy was a scrappy creature with alert, amber eyes and a coat that had seen better seasons, showing the scars of briars and the wear of the road, yet there was a steadiness about her that matched the girl she followed. They were two of a kind, held together by grit and the necessity of the next task. Betty moved with grim, practiced purpose. There was no lingering to watch the mist rise, no wasted motion in her stride. She checked the coop with a steady hand, gathering what eggs the hens had yielded, setting aside a single cracked one without a second thought. She carried water from the heavy rain barrel, bracing her small foot against the wooden side when the iron handle stuck, then filled the shallow basin near the kitchen door. From there she moved to the small patch of land they called a garden. In truth, it was more of an act of survival than a garden. It was a patch of stubborn soil filled with rows of potatoes and a few struggling greens that looked as though they were fighting the earth for every inch of growth. Betty crouched low, her knees sinking into the soft mud. She brushed the dirt from a trembling leaf and pressed the earth back in where the wind or a stray animal had lifted it. All the while her lips moved now and then, not quite speaking, not quite silent, as if she were reciting a litany of chores to keep the tiredness from settling in. Luna watched her the entire time, her tail thumping a dull sound against the ground. "You'd think they might grow quicker if they knew we needed them," Betty murmured. She glanced back at the house, and the small, momentary light in her eyes flickered out. The farmhouse sat low against the rise of the land, its whitewash worn thin in places where the Atlantic weather had taken more than its fair share of the lime. Usually a thin curl of peat smoke should be rising from the chimney by now, signaling a fire in the hearth and a kettle on the boil. It wasn't. That absence of smoke, that cold chimney, was enough to make her heart skip a beat and her feet hurry. She set down the woven basket, wiped her stained hands and her rough skirt, and pushed through the heavy wooden door without knocking. Inside, the air was warmer, but it carried a stagnant weight. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, but it was stale in a way that spoke of too many hours spent in a sick room where the windows stayed shut against the chill. "Ma?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly against the bare stone floor. She was already moving toward the back of the house. There was a rustle from the far room, a dry, papery sound that lacked any real strength. Betty stepped through the narrow doorway and stopped dead. Fay Langan, her mother, was sitting at the very edge of the bed, her nightgown hanging loose on her frame. One hand was braced, white-knuckled against the bedpost, the other reaching toward the small, scarred table where a glass and a dark glass bottle had been left the night before. She shouldn't have been up. The doctor had been clear about the need for stillness. "Ma, what are you doing?" Betty crossed the room in 2 quick steps, her boots clicking sharply. "You'll have yourself worse if you keep this up." I'm only," Faye tried to explain, but the effort of the sentence showed in the way her breath caught halfway through, turning into a shallow, rattling sound that made Betty's stomach tighten. "You're only meant to be resting," Betty said gently. She slipped an arm around her mother's thin shoulders, feeling the prominent bone through the fabric. "Here now, come on, lie back before your legs give out." There was no argument left in her mother, not this morning. The fire that usually burned in Fay Langan's spirit had been dampened down to a pile of grey ash. She let herself be guided, settling back against the thin, lumpy pillow with a quiet sigh that carried more heavy weariness than any sign of relief. "I thought I might take the tonic before you came in," Fay said after a moment, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to bother you, love." "I'd have brought it the second I walked in," Betty replied. She reached for the medicine bottle, turning it slightly toward the grey morning light coming through the pane to judge what was left. There wasn't much, a finger's width of dark, bitter-smelling liquid at the bottom. Betty kept her face steady, a mask of calm that she had perfected over the last few months. She poured what she could into the glass, making sure every drop was accounted for. "Here," she said, holding the glass to her mother's lips. "Take it slowly now, don't rush." Faye took a sip, her hand trembling just enough that Betty kept her own fingers close by, ready to steady the glass if it began to slip. They sat like that for a long moment in the dim light. There was no rush, no noise beyond the quiet swallow of the medicine and the faint, ghostly movement of the wind against the thick stone walls. "Did you sleep at all?" Betty asked, her voice low. "A little," Faye lied. Then, after a long pause, she added, "You were up early. I heard the coop door." "There's things to do. The world doesn't stop just because we're tired." "There's always things to do," Faye sighed. Betty set the empty glass down on the table and looked at the bottle again. She tipped it, watching the last thin, oily line of liquid slide along the bottom. It wouldn't last a week. "Ma," she said, her voice careful and measured. "You said before about the place in Navan, the one with the doctor who has the new equipment, the one who helps people with the lungs." Faye closed her eyes for a moment, her eyelids translucent and blue-veined, as if the mere mention of the name asked more than she could give. "That's not for the likes of us, Betty," she said. "It could be," Betty pressed, though she kept her tone soft so as not to sound like she was scolding. "If we could just find the means, if we had the coin for the transport and the stay." "We don't," Faye said. It wasn't spoken sharply, but with a finality that had been rehearsed many times before. It was the sound of a door closing. Betty swallowed whatever else she had been about to say. The lump in her throat felt like a stone. "It might help," she tried one last time, her voice trailing off into the quiet of the room. "I'm managing," Faye replied, though the laboured way her chest rose and fell beneath the blankets said otherwise. "And you've enough on your plate, child, without chasing things that aren't there. Don't go filling your head with grand ideas." Betty looked at her mother for a long second, seeing the woman who used to carry water 2 buckets at a time, now struggling to hold a glass. "You're not meant to be managing," she said. "You're meant to be getting better." Faye reached out then, her pale hand finding Betty's calloused one. "I have you," she said. "That's enough for any woman." It wasn't enough. They both knew it. But in that small, damp house in the shadow of the hills, neither of them had the heart to say so out loud. By the time the chores were finally finished and her mother had settled into a shallow, fitful sleep, the day had stretched into something brighter. The sun had finally broken through the mist, turning the fields of Meath into a patchwork of brilliant, wet emerald. Betty stood outside the door again, her hands on her hips, looking out over the rise beyond their boundary. "Come on," she said to Luna, who was already by the gate. "We'll go and have a look at the world, will we?" The dog was on her feet before the words had even left Betty's lips. They took the path that led over the hill, a trail worn deep by generations of boots and hooves, though it was never wide enough to be called a proper road. The long grass brushed at their legs, soaked with dew, and the ground was uneven where the ancient roots of the white-thorn trees had pushed through the soil like the knuckles of the earth itself. From the crest of the hill, the land opened out into a vast, rolling plain. In the distance, just past a line of manicured hedges and scattered oak trees, the racing track could be seen. Even from this distance, the energy of the place was palpable. There was movement everywhere, figures in waistcoats, horses being led in long, graceful strides, trainers testing the mettle of their stock. Betty found her pace quickening. Her heart beat a little faster against her ribs. "D'you see that, Luna?" she said, pointing toward the white rails. A faint cheer carried on the wind, followed shortly by the thunderous pounding of hooves against the turf. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the soles of their boots. They came down the far side of the hill and moved closer, though Betty was careful to keep to the edges. She knew where she was welcome and where she was just a ragged girl from the hills. She kept to the perimeter, near the heavy fence line where the locals sometimes gathered to catch a glimpse of the grandeur. The track itself was a broad, magnificent oval of packed earth and groomed grass, the center marked by white posts and colorful flags that snapped and shifted in the breeze. Men moved about with an air of immense importance, owners in fine wool, handlers with leather leads, and men with money enough to treat the life and death of a horse as a mere passing interest. "They'll run them proper next week," Betty said, resting her tired arms on the top rail of the fence. "All of them. The championship and the local stakes. Everyone will be there." Luna's tail wagged, a sharp tap against Betty's shin. "There's a prize," Betty went on, her eyes wide as she watched a black stallion gallop past. "Did I tell you that, Luna? A real prize. Enough to pay a doctor and Navin 10 times over, I'd say. Enough to make a real difference." She watched as 2 horses were brought to the start of a practice run, their muscles rippling like water under their skin. "If we had a horse," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper almost to herself. "If we had just one horse with the heart for it, we could try." The thought hung there in the air between them, daring and dangerous. "If we had one," she repeated, her eyes fixed on the blurring shapes of the horses. "I'd ride it myself, I would. I'd show every one of them that a Langan can outrun the wind." Luna let out a small huff, a sound of agreement, or perhaps just a sigh at the impossibility of it all, and settled down in the grass. "I would," Betty insisted, a small, defiant smile touching her face despite the weight of her mourning. "And we'd win it too, you know. Then we'd have what we need. Ma could go to the clinic, and she could sit in the garden and breathe without it hurting." She exhaled slowly, the smile fading, but the fire in her eyes remaining. "Wouldn't that be something?" "You planning on riding the fence, are you? Or is the grass just particularly interesting today?" The voice behind her cut through the moment like a cold blade. Betty turned, her shoulders squaring instinctively. Morris Gill stood a few paces back. He was a boy about her own age, but he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who owned the ground he stood upon. He wore a coat that had never known a patch, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. "I didn't hear you come up," Betty said, her voice flattening. "That's because you were busy winning races in your head," Morris replied, a slight mocking tilt to his mouth. He walked forward, leaning against the rail with an easy grace that Betty envied. They'd known each other from the village school well enough, though they existed in two different worlds that rarely touched. He was the son of a man who owned half the valley. She was the girl who disappeared into the mist every afternoon to tend to a dying farm. "What are you doing here, Morris?" Betty asked.
"Same as you, I suppose," he said, nodding toward the track. "Watching the real talent. My father's put me forward for the qualifiers next week."
Betty glanced at him, noting the way he puffed out his chest.
"Have you a horse for it then?"
Morris' smile sharpened, becoming something more predatory.
"Of course I do. My father doesn't settle for second best, Betty."
He gestured toward the far side of the paddock, where a magnificent chestnut mare was being walked in a slow, stately circle by a groom. The horse's coat shone like a new copper coin in the sun.
"Winter's Flame," he said,
the name sitting comfortably on his tongue as if it belonged to him by divine right.
"She's taken 2 meets already this season. She's the fastest thing in the county and likely the country."
Betty followed his gaze, watching the way the mare moved.
"She's a fine horse,"
Betty admitted, her own voice devoid of bitterness but full of appreciation for the animal.
"She is that,"
Morris agreed. Then, after a calculated beat, he added,
"Nothing like anything you'd ever find yourself riding."
The words landed light, but they carried the sting of a whip. Betty didn't rise to the bait, keeping her face as still as a mountain pool.
"I'd manage,"
she said.
"With what?"
Morris asked, a short, sharp laugh slipping through his teeth.
"One of the hens from your yard, is it? Or maybe you'll saddle up an old goat."
He glanced down at Luna, who was now standing, her hackles slightly raised.
"Or maybe you'll ride her. She looks like she's about 1 mile away from the boneyard."
Luna let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the very depths of her chest.
"Easy now,"
Morris said, though he didn't step back. He wasn't afraid of the dog. He was too protected by his station to fear anything Betty owned. Betty's hands tightened on the wooden rail until the splinters threatened to pierce her skin.
"I'd find something," she said, "and I'd give you a run for your money."
Morris studied her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her worn shawl and her muddied boots.
"You'd need more than something, Betty. You'd need a proper stable, quality feed, professional training. You'd need a pedigree."
He paused, then added with a fake air of casualness,
"And you'd need time for it, which you don't have, do you? I hear your farm is barely holding together."
Betty said nothing. She couldn't deny the truth, and she couldn't give him the satisfaction of a lie. Morris's gaze drifted back toward the track, then returned to her face.
"I heard about your mother too," he said.
That caught her off guard. Her head lifted, her eyes narrowing.
"What about her?" "Only that she's not well,"
Morris said, shrugging one shoulder.
"People talk about it in the village. They say she's fading."
There was no sympathy in his voice. It was a statement of fact, used as a weight to keep her in her place.
"You'd be kept busy enough tending to her," he went on. "Hard to see where you'd fit a race in between the cleaning and the nursing. Best to leave the running to those of us who have the time for it."
Betty held his look, her heart hammering with a mixture of shame and white-hot fury.
"I'll manage that too,"
she said, her voice like flint. Morris let out a short breath through his nose, a sound of pure derision.
"If you say so, Betty, if you say so."
He pushed off the rail, straightening his fine coat and adjusting his cap.
"Well," he said, "best of luck with the, whatever it is you do up in that hill. Truly."
The word truly lingered in the air, stripped of any real meaning, sounding more like an insult than a wish. He took a few steps away, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder.
"Just don't get your hopes up too high,"
he added, his voice dropping an octave.
"Stick to the eggs and the potatoes. It's safer, Betty."
And with that, he turned and made his way toward the far side of the track, where his beautiful horse and his wealthy father waited. Betty watched him go, her breath coming in slow draws. Luna pressed her flank hard against Betty's leg, a solid, grounding presence in the face of the boy's cruelty.
"Pay him no mind,"
Betty said after a moment, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the dog or her own bruised heart. Out on the track, the next pair of horses were being brought forward, their coats gleaming, their riders confident. Betty rested her arms back on the rail, her eyes following every movement, every flick of a tail, every stride of a powerful leg. She didn't see a race, she saw a way out. She saw a doctor's bill paid and a mother who could breathe again. "If we just had one," she said quietly into the wind. "Just one chance." The wind shifted suddenly, blowing cold from the north. Somewhere far beyond the hill of Tara, where the ancient kings once stood, a low roll of thunder moved across the sky. It was distant and muffled, but it carried a weight that seemed to vibrate into the very soil beneath her feet. The sky above them was still a clear, mocking blue, but the air had changed. Something was coming. Betty shivered, pulled her shawl tighter, and turned her back on the track. She had work to do, and the storm, whatever it was, wouldn't wait for her to be ready. That night, the house wouldn't settle. It was as if the very stones of the cottage were bracing for an impact that hadn't yet arrived. The wind moved around the thick lime walls in long, restless breaths, pushing with a rhythmic, insistent force against the loose frame of the kitchen window until it rattled like bone against bone. Inside, the fire had burned down to a low, glowing heart of red buried under a heavy shroud of grey ash. Every so often, a small defiant flame would lift itself from the embers, flickering briefly as if remembering the heat it once possessed before falling back into the dark. Betty sat in a low wooden chair beside her mother's bed, her spine aching and a damp cloth folded neatly in her lap. The room felt smaller in the dark, the corners swallowed by shadows that seemed to pulse with the wind. Faye had taken a turn for the worse, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the transition had been a cruel one. It had come on slow at first, a sudden unnatural flush in the woman's hollow cheeks and a bright, feverish shine across her brow that looked like oil on water. Then the coughing started. It was a deep, racking sound that seemed to pull the very strength from her marrow each time it took hold. Betty had helped her sit forward, bracing her mother with one hand against her frail back, while the other gripped the wash basin until the worst of the fit had finally passed. Now Faye lay back against the thin pillow, her eyes half open and glazed with exhaustion, breathing through parted, dry lips. The sound of her respiration was a thin, whistling thing, like a winter breeze through a keyhole. Betty dipped the cloth into the ceramic bowl of cool water, wrung it out until it was just damp, and laid it carefully across her mother's forehead. "There now," she whispered. Her own voice sounded foreign in the quiet room. "That'll cool you down a bit." Faye's fingers moved weakly against the rough linen sheet, searching for something to hold. "Betty?" "I'm right here, Ma. I'm not going anywhere." "You should sleep, child. You've been on your feet since dawn." "I'm grand," Betty said, though the heaviness behind her eyes felt like lead. "I've plenty of time to sleep." "You say that every night," Faye murmured, her voice trailing off. "And every night I'm right, haven't I?" A faint, ghostly smile moved across Faye's mouth, then faded as quickly as it had appeared. Even the simple act of smiling seemed to cost her more energy than she had to spare. Betty reached for the small bottle of medicine on the bedside table. It was a dark, medicinal amber in the candlelight, but as she tilted it, she saw the truth. There was barely enough liquid left to wet the bottom of the glass. She held it up to the guttering candle and turned it slowly, watching the last few drops cling to the sides. Faye saw her looking. Even in her fever, the woman was sharp. "There's no use worrying at it, Betty," she said softly. "I'm not worrying. I'm just checking." "You are. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, love." Betty set the bottle down with a quiet thud. "It's meant to be taken regularly, Ma. The doctor was firm on that. If you don't take it regular, how's it meant to do the work it's supposed to do?" Faye closed her eyes wearily. "Come morning," she said. "We'll think on it come morning. The world always looks different in the light." Betty said nothing because she didn't want to lie. She already knew exactly what the morning would bring. It would bring a small, frayed purse with far too little copper inside it. It would bring a chemist in town who counted every coin twice before he would even think of reaching for a shelf. It would bring a long, lonely road home with only half of what she needed, if she was lucky enough to even get that much. Suddenly a sharp sound broke through her thoughts. Luna was scratching lightly at the back door. Betty turned her head, listening. The dog scratched again, more insistent this time, and gave a quiet, high-pitched whine that spoke of something more than just wanting to go out.
"Ah, Luna, not now,"
Betty muttered, pushing herself up from the chair. Her joints popped with the effort. She checked her mother one more time, tucking the woolen blanket firmly around the woman's narrow shoulders.
"I'll only be outside a minute, Ma, just to see to the dog."
Faye's eyes opened a sliver.
"Don't go too far into the dark, Betty. The air's heavy tonight." "I won't. I'll be back before you know it."
Betty snatched her shawl from the back of the chair, wrapped it around her, and lifted the iron lantern from its peg beside the door. Luna was already shifting with a frantic sort of impatience when Betty stepped into the kitchen. The dog's ears were flat against her head, and her tail stayed low.
"Come on, then," Betty said, thumbing the latch. "Quick about it, now I have no time for games."
The dog didn't wait for a second invitation. She slipped out into the yard ahead of Betty, disappearing almost instantly into the thick, swirling mist that had swallowed the world. Outside, the night was a wall of white and grey. The mist lay low over the ground, gathered in deep dips of the field and clinging to the old lichen-covered stones near the boundary wall. The moon was hidden somewhere behind a heavy bank of cloud, providing only a pale, smudged glow that made the fog seem to shimmer with its own light. Beyond the yard, the familiar fields had softened into strange, unrecognizable shapes. Further still, the trees stood like black, jagged teeth against the sky. Luna didn't stop to sniff at the usual spots. She trotted with a singular purpose toward the back lane that led to the little patch of ancient woodland behind the farmhouse. Betty followed, holding the lantern low to guide her feet over the slick, muddy ruts.
"Would you don't be taking me halfway to trim, Luna?"
she warned, her breath looming in the cold air.
"I have enough to be doing without chasing you through the briars."
Luna ignored her, her nose pressed hard to the ground, her pace quickening as they passed through the gap in the hedge and into the shadows of the trees. The air changed the moment they stepped under the canopy. It always did. Even in the height of summer, the wood seemed to hold on to its own secret weather, a damp, ancient chill that smelled of moss and forgotten things. At night, with the mist threaded between the silvered trunks of the ash and oak, it felt like stepping behind a heavy curtain into a much older part of the world, where the rules of men didn't quite apply. Betty slowed down, her boots crunching on fallen twigs. She waited near a gnarled ash tree while Luna nosed about in a thicket of ferns.
"Come on now, will you hurry up?"
she whispered, the silence of the wood making her own voice feel a bit too loud. The dog stopped abruptly, her head lifted, and she went perfectly still. Betty noticed the change at once. It was a shift in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up.
"What is it, girl?"
Luna's ears went forward, and a low, vibrating growl started deep in her throat, a sound so quiet and guttural that Betty felt it in her own chest more than she heard it. Then a voice came drifting through the trees. It was a deep, resonant sound filled with a cold, biting anger. It was too far away to catch every syllable at first, yet it was close enough to set the skin along Betty's arms prickling with a sudden, sharp dread. "You shameful thing," the voice rumbled, sounding like grinding stones. Betty went still, the lantern swinging slightly in her hand, casting long, dancing shadows against the trunks. Luna stepped closer to her leg, her body trembling with the suppressed ferocity. The voice came again, louder, dripping with contempt. "Look at you, standing there like a common cart horse left to rot in a bog. a waste of skin and spirit. There was another sound then, the heavy wet shift of a horse, moving. Hooves dragged and scraped against the soft, leaf-strewn earth. Every instinct Betty possessed told her to turn back. She knew she should. Her mother was lying ill in a cold house. The woods were no place for a girl at midnight. Whatever man was out there speaking with a voice like a landslide had no business being there at all, and yet a strange magnetic pull drew her forward. She moved a few steps, her heart hammering against her ribs, then a few more. Luna stayed tight beside her, a silent shadow. Between the pale trunks ahead, a dark shape began to form in the shifting mist. Betty raised the lantern just a few inches, squinting into the gloom. The figure standing there was immensely tall, taller than any man she'd ever seen in the markets of Navan. It wore a long, heavy black coat that seemed to move with its own life, swirling slowly in a wind that Betty couldn't feel. One arm hung motionless at its side, the other held something pale and rounded near its hip. At first, Betty's mind refused to make sense of the image. She thought it was a sack or perhaps a large stone. Then the figure moved its weight, and the pale object turned slightly in the lantern's dim reach. A head, a human head held firmly by long, black hair. Betty clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle the scream. The lantern nearly slipped from her white-knuckled grip. The face in the figure's grip was long and dead white, like the cold snows of winter. Its eyes weren't eyes at all, but burning pits of a dim, terrible light that flickered like dying coals. When the figure spoke, it wasn't the body that moved, but the mouth of the severed head. "You were bred for the road between worlds," the head snarled, its teeth clicking together. "You are bred to hear the call of the dark and run until the very ground split under your hooves." A massive black horse stood before the creature. It was a terrifying animal, with a heavy, matted mane and a coat so profoundly dark that the surrounding mist actually seemed lighter in comparison. Its head hung low, almost touching the dirt. Its ribs rose and fell in hard, shuddering gasps. One front leg trembled violently under its massive weight, as if it were about to buckle. And hanging round its neck was a bronze chain, housing a glowing emerald. "And what did I get for my trouble?" the head continued, its voice rising in a jagged crescendo. "A slow, stubborn, sulking brute with nothing but common mud in its blood." The horse gave a faint, pathetic snort and tried to move back, but its strength seemed spent. The figure in the coat raised a long, curved whip, a whip made of what looked to be a human spine. Betty saw the edge of it catch the stray flash of her lantern light. It was a long, cruel thing, something bred from a nightmare. "You shame the Dullahan kind," the head hissed. "You shame me with your weakness." The word Dullahan struck Betty with a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air. She had heard the old stories since she was old enough to sit by a fire. Everyone in Meath knew about them, the riders without heads, the coaches of bone, the dark roads that led only to the grave, names called out in the dead of light that acted as a summons no soul could refuse. The whip came down. It struck the horse across the shoulder with a sickening heavy thud that made Betty flinch, as if she had been hit herself. The horse stumbled, its hooves sliding in the muck, but it somehow caught itself and stood still, its head drooping even lower. Luna barked then, a sharp, furious sound that echoed through the trees. Betty grabbed the dog's collar, pulling her back. The Dullahan's massive body turned with a slow, dreadful grace. For one heart-stopping moment, the head in its hand looked straight through the trees, directly toward the patch of shadow where Betty stood. Betty stopped breathing entirely. The burning eyes in the severed head narrowed, searching the mist. Then the horse moved again, drawing the creature's attention back to its task. "Go on, then," the Dullahan spat, the voice vibrating through the wood. "Away with you. Let the crows race you across the fields. You might actually beat one if the bird is lame." The black horse didn't move. It looked like a broken thing. The Doulahan stepped closer, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the clearing. "You're cast from my company. No road of mine will carry you again. No gate will ever open under your hooves. Find a ditch and die in it. Find a butcher to rend you. Find whatever miserable end suits a beast that would rather stand and sulk than serve the king of the road." He swung the whip again, this time striking the ground inches from the horse's front legs. Earth jumped into the air, and the mist curled away from the bone in terror. The horse reared slightly, a flicker of fear finally touching its eyes. The Doulahan didn't look back. He turned away, his long heavy coat dragging through the wet bracken as he walked into the heart of the trees. The head in his hand twisted once more, glaring back at the animal over the creature's shoulder. "Useless nag," the head muttered. Then the mist simply took him. He didn't fade away, he was just gone, as if the woods had folded him into a pocket of shadow. For a long time, nothing moved. The silence was absolute, heavier even than the mist. Betty stayed exactly where she was, one hand still buried deep in Luna's fur, her heart knocking so hard against her chest that she could feel the pulse in the very tips of her fingers. The horse stood alone in the center of the clearing, its head lowered again until its muzzle almost touched the wet leaves. A dark, jagged line showed across its massive shoulder where the whip had struck, a welt that was already beginning to seep. Luna stopped growling. She looked up at Betty and gave a small, uncertain whine. Betty's throat felt like it was lined with sand.
"We should go home, Luna,"
she whispered, her voice trembling.
"Right now, we should just walk away."
The horse made a small sound then. It wasn't a whinny or a snort. It was a quiet, broken noise that sounded almost like a sob. It was the sound of a creature that had been stripped of its purpose and its pride in a single night. Betty looked back toward the safety of the farmhouse, where the lamp was still burning in the window. Then she looked back at the horse, abandoned and bleeding in the dark.
"Oh, you poor thing,"
she said softly. She took one careful, tentative step forward into the clearing. The horse's ears twitched, but it didn't look up.
It's all right,"
Betty said, her voice becoming steadier the closer she got.
"I won't hurt you. I'm not like him."
The horse backed away a single step, its hooves unsteady. Betty stopped at once, holding her hands out where the animal could see them.
"All right, that's all right. I'll stay right here, see?"
She lowered the lantern a little so the harsh light wouldn't shine straight into its large, dark eyes.
"You're hurt, you know. He gave you a nasty lash."
The horse watched her, its gaze weary and filled with an ancient, unfathomable sorrow. Betty moved again, slower, speaking in a low, melodic rhythm that she usually reserved for her mother during the worst of the coughing fits.
"He had no right to do that to you. I don't care if he's the king of the road or the devil himself. No one has the right to beat a creature just because it's frightened or tired."
The horse breathed out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound trembling in the cold air.
"There now,"
Betty said, her hand reaching out.
"That's it, just a little closer."
She waited, the woods stilled. At last, the horse lowered its head, just enough for her fingers to graze the side of its powerful, velvet-soft neck. The coat was freezing cold from the mist, but life pulsed strongly under the skin, a heartbeat that felt like a drum in the deep earth.
"There you are," she whispered. "You're not useless. You're just scared and lost, just like the rest of us."
She stepped closer, inspecting the wound.
"You can't stay out here in the wet anyway,"
she said, her mind already working.
"He might come back if his temper hasn't cooled, and I wouldn't fancy meeting that one twice in a single night either."
She took the loose strand of old braided rope that was still hanging from the horse's neck. The horse gave a nervous high lift of its head as she touched the cord.
"I'll be gentle, I promise," she said.
Luna sniffed at the horse's back leg, received no kick in return, and seemed to decide that the beast was part of the pack now.
"Come on then.
Betty said, giving the rope a tiny, encouraging tug.
We'll get you back to the yard. We'll get you home.
The horse took one tentative step, then another. It followed her out of the clearing and back through the gap in the hedge. They moved slowly, with many pauses and little flinches whenever a low-hanging branch brushed against its flank. Betty didn't pull. She walked right beside it, her hand resting on its nose to let it know she was there. As they made their way through the dark toward the farmhouse, she kept talking. It helped her own fear of the shadows, and she sensed it helped the horse's fear too.
Was he truly your master? She asked. Is that how it works with the likes of him? Do they just take what they want and cast it away when it tires?
The horse only snorted, the sound like a bellows.
He said you weren't fit for the road. He said you were slow and had mud in your blood.
She glanced up at the massive dark silhouette.
You don't look slow to me. You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your back for far too long.
A branch cracked sharply somewhere behind them in the woods. Betty stopped, looked back. Luna looked back, baring her teeth. But nothing emerged from the fog. Whatever was back there stayed back there, and so they walked on.
He wanted terrible things from you, I suppose,
Betty continued.
A horse to tear across the world with no care for the living. Maybe he didn't want that. Maybe he wouldn't run for a man who carries his own head in his hand.
The horse's large head lowered, resting almost on her shoulder.
And he didn't like being told no either, I'd say.
The farmhouse finally appeared through the mist, a small, dark island in the sea of grey. Betty brought the horse into the yard through the side gate, being careful not to let the latch clang. The old, sagging shed near the boundary wall had once held a dairy cow years before Betty was born. Now it was a graveyard for spare boards, broken rakes, and old grain sacks.
It's not much of a palace,
she said, pushing the heavy door open with her shoulder.
But it's dry, and the wind won't find you here.
She led the horse inside and tied the rope loosely to a rusted iron ring in the wall, giving him enough slack to lie down if he chose. Luna sat in the doorway, her amber eyes never leaving the animal. Betty fetched a bucket of water, then tore clean strips from an old soft cloth. She brought the little tin of green ointment they kept for farm animals, cuts and burns.
This might sting a bit,
she warned, holding the tin up. The horse turned its head, watching her hand with an intensity that was almost unnerving.
I'm sorry if it hurts, but it'll keep the infections out.
She cleaned the wound as carefully as a surgeon, dabbing away the blood and the grit from the forest floor. The horse did flinch, a powerful ripple of muscle that knocked the bucket with one heavy hoof, but he didn't strike out at her.
You're a brave lad,
Betty said, her voice soft. The horse gave her a look, a sidelong glance that seemed almost offended by the word lad.
All right,
she said, a small tired laugh escaping her despite the gravity of the night.
You're a fierce and terrifying creature of the night. My mistake.
She worked until the wound was cleared and the ointment was spread thick across the worst of it. Only then, with the lantern hung from a bent nail on the rafter, did she really look at him in the light. He was magnificent in a strange, rough-hewn way. He was far too large for their little shed, his head nearly brushing the roof. His coat wasn't just black, it was a deep, bottomless obsidian that seemed to absorb the lantern light. His mane fell in tangled, wild waves, and his eyes held a depth of intelligence that made Betty feel as though he understood the history of the hills better than she did. Then there was the green gem around his neck.
That's a pretty thing,
Betty said.
Do all Doulahan steeds have one of these?
The horse looked down at her briefly, then looked away. When Betty moved to clear the bucket, she saw the mark. On its hind leg, just above the fetlock, the hair grew in a strange, pale spiral against the black. It wasn't a scar, it was natural, as if the colour had been placed there by a painter. It was a curling, intricate shape, like the old carvings she'd seen on the ancient stones near the hill of Tara, turning inward and outward at the same time. Betty crouched beside it.
Well now,
she whispered,
aren't you truly something special? Have you a name, I wonder? Or did he just call you names?
The horse blinked slowly.
No, I suppose you wouldn't tell me even if you had one.
Betty looked toward Luna, who was currently occupied with cleaning a paw.
What do you think, Luna? What do we call a fairy horse?
Luna merely yawned, showing her teeth.
Well, that's no help at all.
A sudden patter began on the tin roof of the shed. Rain. It started soft, a gentle tapping, then grew heavier, ticking over the metal in a quickening, insistent tapping. Beyond the yard, the thunder rolled again, deeper and more resonant than before. It seemed to come from the direction of Tara itself, a low vibration that travelled through the very bones of the hills. Betty looked back at the horse. His ears were pricked, listening to the storm.
Storm,
she said, the word fitting the moment perfectly. The horse's ears came forward at the sound of the word. She smiled, a real smile this time.
Storm of Tara. That has a ring to it, doesn't it?
The rain rushed into a downpour, drumming a heavy beat across the roof.
That's what I'll call you,
she said, her voice firm.
Storm of Tara. You belong to the hill now, not to that headless maniac.
The horse lowered his head, blowing a soft breath against her cheek. Betty laid her hand against his face, her skin against his, very gently.
There now,
she whispered.
You'll be safe here. No one's going to cast you away again.
By the time the first grey light of dawn touched the yard, the rain had passed, leaving the world sparkling and wet. The hens stepped out of their coop, high-stepping through the mud with their usual air of offence. Luna trotted out first, stretched her long limbs, and looked toward the shed with a wag of her tail. Betty rose from the wooden chair beside her mother's bed. She had slept in short, broken pieces through what remained of the night, her dreams filled with galloping shadows and silver heads. Faye was still asleep. Her breathing sounded a little easier, the whistling rattle having subsided for the moment, though the profound weakness in her face seemed to grow more pronounced with every passing hour. Betty stood over her for a long minute, watching the rise and fall of the blankets. The room was quiet. The morning sun touched the edge of the bed, the small table, and the nearly empty bottle of medicine. Betty reached out and brushed a loose strand of grey hair from her mother's cheek.
Our luck might be changing, Ma,
she whispered.
You never know what the road might bring.
Faye didn't wake. Betty went outside, the cold air snapping her awake. She crossed the yard and pushed open the shed door. Storm of Tara was standing exactly where she had left him, very still, watching the door with those deep, ancient eyes.
Morning,
Betty said, trying to sound braver than she felt as the reality of the situation set in.
So he didn't vanish with the mist. That's a start.
The horse gave no answer, but he didn't pull away when she approached.
That's something, at least.
She fed him what she could spare from the dwindling grain sack. It was less than a horse of his size truly needed, and more than the farm could actually afford to give, but she couldn't let him hunger. He ate slowly at first, as if he didn't trust the offering, then finished it with a sudden ravenous interest. After the morning chores were done, Betty dragged an old, dusty saddle from the far, cobwebbed corner of the shed. It had belonged to her father, though she had only the faintest memories of him ever using it. The leather was stiff and cracked in places, the brass knuckles green with age, and the stirrup straps were so dry they groaned when she moved them. Storm eyed the saddle as if it were a personal insult to his dignity.
I know,
Betty said, bracing herself.
It's not grand, and it smells of old hay. But nothing's perfect, and neither are we. We'll just have to make do.
She brushed him down first, her movements steady. He tolerated the grooming, though he kept his ears back, watching her every move. Then came the saddle. The moment the leather touched its back, he stepped sideways with a sudden powerful lurch that nearly pinned Betty against the stone wall.
Easy,
she hissed.
Easy now, you great brute. I'm only trying to help.
Luna barked from the doorway, a sharp note of warning.
Don't you start encouraging him, Luna.
After a long, sweaty struggle and a series of quiet, desperate negotiations, Betty finally managed to get the girth tightened. She led him out into the centre of the yard. The morning was still early enough that most of the neighbours would be busy with milking or still nursing their tea. The track would be quiet. Betty placed one muddy foot into the iron stirrup. Storm turned his massive head and stared at her with what could only be described as profound judgment.
I'm only getting on, she muttered. Stop looking at me like that.
He continued to stare.
You know, you're awfully dramatic for someone who spent half his life with a man who carries his head in his hand.
She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming. For one breathless, terrifying moment, she was seated. She was high, very high from the ground. The familiar yard looked small and insignificant from the back of such a beast. The house even looked like a toy. Storm didn't move a muscle. He was like a statue carved from coal. Betty gathered the reins, her hands trembling.
Walk on, Storm. Let's see what you can do.
Nothing. He remained rooted to the spot.
Go on now,
she urged, nudging him with her heels. Storm stood like a thing of stone. Luna wandered over and sniffed at his front hoof, then looked up at Betty as if to say, well?
Well, maybe don't mock him, Luna,
Betty said to the dog. She gave the reins the slightest, most respectful tug. Storm lifted one massive hoof, placed it down exactly where it had been, and stopped again. Betty let out a long, frustrated sigh.
We'll be old and grey by the time we even reach the gate at this rate.
There was another long, heavy pause. Then, without any warning at all, Storm simply walked. It wasn't a trot or a gallop, but a slow, deliberate stride. Betty nearly lost her balance at the sudden shift.
Oh, good boy, that's it.
He moved through the yard, out the side gate, and onto the narrow path that led toward the hills. He moved slowly, painfully slow. It was the walk of a horse that had nowhere to go and all the time in the world to get there. Still, he was moving. Betty sat up straighter in the old saddle, the wind catching her hair. She felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks, not since the doctor had first visited the house. She felt a glimmer of a future. It was a small, foolish, and incredibly fragile hope, but it was there, pulsing like the horse's heart beneath her. They reached the racing track as the last of the morning mist was burning off. It appeared empty at first glance, the white rails stark against the green, but then a voice called out from the far side, dripping with familiar honey-coated venom.
Well, would you look at that? The Queen of the Hill has arrived.
Betty's shoulders sank before she even turned her head. Morris Gill sat perched atop Winter's Flame near the starting post. He was dressed in a smart riding jacket and polished tall boots, looking every bit the gentleman rider. His horse tossed her head, her copper coat gleaming, looking ready to fly. Morris rode closer, his eyes moving slowly from Betty's frayed shawl to the battered saddle and finally to the massive, silent black horse beneath her.
Where in the hell of all that's holy did you get that mountain? He asked, a smirk playing on his lips.
I found him, Betty said.
Found him? You don't just find a horse like that. Did he wander out of a nightmare? Or did you pull him out of a bog?
Betty kept her chin up, refusing to look down at him.
His name is Storm of Tara.
Morris stared at her for a heartbeat, his expression blank. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, mocking sound that echoed off the hills.
Storm of Tara?
He laughed again, the sound grating on Betty's nerves.
That's a mighty grand name for such a sorry-looking, heavy-footed brute.
He's not sorry-looking, Betty snapped.
He looks like he's half asleep on his feet, Morris said. Would you look at him? He's got the grace of a funeral barge. He's been hurt. He's recovering. That explains the lack of speed, I suppose. Oh, and the smell of old wood.
Betty's cheeks burned a deep, furious red. Morris brought Winter's Flame right alongside them. The chestnut mare was half the size of Storm, but she looked twice as fast.
Go on then, Betty,
Morris said, his eyes glinting with mischief.
Let's see this Storm in action. Give us a show.
Betty gripped the reins, her knuckles white.
Come on now, Storm. Show 'em.
Storm didn't move. He didn't even twitch an ear. Morris leaned forward in his saddle, his smile widening to a smug grin.
Maybe the poor thing didn't hear you, or maybe he doesn't speak peasant.
Betty clicked her tongue sharply. Storm blinked, his eyes fixed on the horizon.
Walk on, Storm, please,
she urged, her voice bordering on plea. Nothing. Storm stood as if his hooves had grown deep roots into the very dirt of the track.
Morris burst out into a fresh fit of laughter. Winter's flame moved under him, her muscles tensing as she prepared to bolt, while Storm remained as immobile as a tombstone. "Very exciting indeed," Morris said, wiping a mock tear from his eyes. "My heart's absolutely racing. I don't know if the county can handle such raw power."
Betty tried one more time, her voice a humiliated whisper.
"Please, Storm, just a step."
Storm flickered one ear, as if he were annoyed by a fly, but remained stationary. Morris circled them one last time at a brisk, elegant trot.
"Storm of Tara," he said, testing the weight of the name aloud. No, that won't do at all. That's false advertising."
He looked back over his shoulder as he began to trot away toward the centre of the track.
"Snore of Tara. That suits him better, I think. You should see about getting a sign made."
Luna, who'd followed them all the way and was now standing by the fence, suddenly let out a growl so sharp and feral that Morris's horse gave a startled toss of her head. Morris laughed again, the sound carrying on the wind.
"Careful now, Betty. That dog has more fire than that horse. Maybe you should put the saddle on her instead."
He trotted off down the long stretch of track, Winter's flame moving with a quick, effortless grace that made the distance seem like nothing. Betty sat there in a sudden silence, the sun beating down on her head. Storm remained perfectly still. She leaned forward, her chest pressing against his neck, and whispered into his ear,
"Pay no mind, Storm. He's nothing but piss and wind."
As she looked around, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. A large wooden board stood near the track entrance, and a poster had been nailed there recently. The paper was still crisp. The corners hadn't yet curled by the morning dampness. It read, "Annual Meath Championship Qualifiers, open to all entries, qualifying races next week, winners advance to the Grand Final." Below the bold headers, in a smaller, darker lettering, was the promise that had Betty's heart leaping into her throat. A purse of £50 for the championship winner. Betty stared at the number until it blurred. £50. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was a new roof. It was a warm winter. It was the finest doctor in the county for her mother. Her heart lifted with a sudden, violent hope. Then it sank as she felt the heavy, motionless weight of the horse beneath her. Then, stubbornly, it lifted again. Storm gave a slow, deep breath, his chest expanding under the saddle. Betty looked down at him, at the tangled dark mane, the healing wound on his shoulder, and the mysterious pale spiral on his leg.
"You heard what he called you,"
she said, her voice trembling with a new kind of resolve.
"Snore of Tara."
Storm turned his massive head enough for one large obsidian eye to meet hers. There was something in that look, not dullness, but a patient, waiting power that Morris Gill would never understand. Betty managed a small, hard smile.
"We'll see about that, won't we?"
The horse didn't move, but for the first time, Betty felt a change in the air around him. It felt like the moments before a lightning strike. 1 week. She had 1 week to turn a fairy's discarded nag into a champion. As they turned to head back toward the small, crumbling farm, the distant thunder rolled over the hill of Tara once more, and this time it sounded like an answer. The first few days of that final week tested Betty Langan more than anything she'd endured before. It wasn't the grueling physical labour of the farm, for she was well acquainted with the ache of a long day's work. It was not the gnawing worry that lived in her stomach like a cold stone, nor even the long harrowing nights spent in the flickering candlelight beside her mother's bed. It was the horse. Storm possessed a mind of his own, and it wasn't a mind that bent easily to the will of a girl. He was a creature of profound, silent contradictions. Some mornings he would stand as quiet as an ancient monolith while Betty brushed the dried mud from his flanks, letting her hand move along the powerful curve of his neck as if he'd always belonged to her and her alone. On those mornings she allowed herself to believe they were a team, but the next day the wind would change and so would he. He would step away the same second she came near, turning his massive obsidian body just enough to keep a deliberate distance between them, watching her with that same deep, unreadable look that made her feel like an intruder in her own yard. It wasn't fear that drove him. Fear would have been a language Betty understood. Fear could be soothed with a soft word or a handful of grain. This was something else entirely. It was a stubbornness that felt older than the shed, older than the hills of Meath, and perhaps older even than the legends of the High Kings.
"Would you make up your mind, you great black mountain?"
Betty muttered one Tuesday morning, her brush poised in midair.
"Are you mine, or are you still wandering the road between worlds?"
Storm merely flickered a velvet ear and looked toward the horizon, his gaze fixed on the distant emerald rise of Tara.
"That's no answer at all,"
she sighed, dropping the brush into the bucket. Luna lay nearby in a patch of weak sunlight, her chin resting on her paws. She watched the exchange with a weary, knowing expression, as if she had seen this play performed 1,000 times before and already knew the ending. Betty tried the saddle again. The first attempt that day saw Storm sidestep with a sudden, fluid grace before she even reached his side. The second time he stood perfectly still, allowing her to lay the heavy leather across his back, only to shift his weight with such violent precision that the saddle slid clean off and landed with a sickening bump in the dirt. By the third attempt, Betty had mud caked up to her sleeves, a stinging scratch across her palm, and a temper she was trying very hard to keep from boiling over.
"I'm not going fighting with you every hour,"
she cried, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps.
"I've enough on my plate, Storm. My mother's dying in that house, the roof is leaking, and I've a race to win. I don't have the luxury of you deciding to be difficult. Please."
Storm lowered his head and began to chew on a stray dry bit of hay, as if she had said absolutely nothing at all. He looked utterly bored by her desperation. Betty closed her eyes, forcing the hot tears of frustration back. She counted to 10, the way her mother used to do when the world felt too heavy.
"Right,"
she whispered.
"We'll try again."
She did try again, and yet again. When she finally managed to get the girth tightened and hauled herself up into the seat, Storm walked exactly 3 steps toward the gate, stopped dead, and refused to move another inch. He was a statue once more.
"Go on, Storm, move,"
she urged, clicking her tongue. Nothing. He might as well have been carved from the stone of the hill. She gave him a gentle, encouraging nudge with her heels. Storm barely budged and looked back at her with an expression of mild offense, as if her request were an unspeakable rudeness. Defeated for the moment, Betty slid down from the saddle.
"Grand,"
she said under her breath.
"That's just bloody grand."
Inside the cottage, the air was heavy with the smell of vinegar and stale sweat. Faye's condition had settled into something quieter, but to Betty's eyes it was no less terrifying. The fever came and went like a thief in the night. The coughing lingered, a dry, persistent hacking that seemed to be dragging the very life out of the woman, bit by agonizing bit. The dark brown medicine bottle was finally empty by the third morning. Betty held it up to the light coming through the small kitchen pane, turning it over and over as if a few extra drops might have miraculously appeared in the glass overnight, but the bottle remained stubbornly dry.
"I'll go into town,"
Betty said, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. Faye stirred beneath the heavy quilts, her eyes fluttered open.
"You've been to town already this week, love." "I'll go again. I need to see the chemist." "There's no use going if you've got no money in the jar, Betty."
Betty didn't know what to say. Instead, she just adjusted the blanket and smoothed her mother's hair.
"I'll manage it,"
she said firmly.
"Rest now."
She left Luna to guard the door and made the long trek down the muddy road toward Navan. The chemist's shop was a cramped, narrow place wedged between a grocer and a tailor, its window cluttered with blue glass bottles and neatly hand-lettered labels for tonics and cures. The bell above the door gave a sharp, judgmental ring as she stepped inside. The chemist, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, was busy measuring a white powder into a square of folded paper. He didn't look up when she approached the counter.
I need more of the lung mixture for Fay Langan, please,
Betty said, her voice small but clear. The man finished his task with agonizing slowness, then peered over the rims of his glasses. And have you the money for it this time?
I'll have it soon. Within a week, I promise.
That wasn't the question I asked. Betty swallowed hard.
I've only a little today, just a few pence, but she needs it. You said it yourself, it's the only thing that will clear the rattle.
I said I'd help if it were taken properly and consistently, the chemist interrupted, his voice flat. I didn't say I was running a charity for every farm in Meath. I have my own bills to pay.
She'll get worse without it. She's already fading.
She likely will, the man agreed plainly, as if he were discussing the price of wool. Betty stepped closer, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter.
I'll pay you an extra few pennies, I swear, on the hill of Tara itself. There's a race next week, the qualifiers. If I can just...
The chemist let out a short, cynical breath. Everyone in this county has a plan, Betty. Very few have actual coin. Plans don't buy my ingredients. He turned, reaching for a bottle on the high shelf. He measured out a meagre amount, perhaps a third of what she needed. That's half a course, he said, sliding the small vial across the wood. It'll hold her for a few days if you're careful with the dosage, not a drop more.
But that's not enough to stop the fever,
Betty said, looking at the tiny bottle. It's exactly what you can afford with the pence you've bought. If you want the rest, you bring the coins.
I'll bring it though, I promise.
When you have the money, you can have the medicine, not before. Betty stared at the bottle, her hands tightening into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She felt a wave of hot, helpless shame wash over her.
Please,
she whispered. The chemist didn't move. He simply went back to his papers. Take it or leave it, Betty. I have other customers. Betty reached out, grabbed the bottle, and fled the shop. Back at the farmhouse, desperation drove her to attempt the impossible. She gathered every egg the hens had produced, even the small ones, and brought them to a neighbor who occasionally bought them for her baking. The woman looked at Betty's tired face, took 2 eggs out of pity, and said she had no need for more. She went to the garden next and dug up the potatoes a month too early, her fingers clawing through the cold mud. When she carried them down the lane to the market, the merchant told her they were too small for the table and offered her nothing. She even tried to offer her services to a travelling merchant passing through on his way to Dublin, offering to mend his torn coat, but her hands, cracked and shaking from the cold, were clumsy with the needle. The man looked at her jagged stitching, laughed kindly enough, and told her to keep the thread. He walked on without paying. By evening, she had gained nothing but a sore back and a deeper sense of doom. That night, Faye's fever spiked again. The room was stiflingly hot, yet her mother was shivering as if she were trapped in a snowdrift. Betty sat by her side, measuring the precious medicine with a shaking hand, counting each drop as if they were diamonds.
It'll help, Ma. I promise it will,
she said, her voice cracking. Faye tried to smile, but her eyes were glassy and distant.
You've always been so good with the counting, love,
she murmured, her mind wandering.
I'll get more tomorrow. I've a plan.
You'll wear yourself thin, Betty, chasing things that aren't there.
I'll not. I'm strong.
Faye reached out, her fingers like dry twigs, and found Betty's hand.
You're only a child, Betty. You shouldn't have the weight of the world on your back like this.
Betty shook her head, a tear finally escaping and rolling through the dirt on her cheek.
I haven't been a child for a very long time now.
She stayed in the chair until her mother's breathing finally evened out into a fitful sleep. Then she heard a sound at the kitchen window. Thump, thump. She rose and went to the door. Storm was standing in the middle of the yard, his dark shape nearly invisible against the night. He wasn't grazing, he was simply standing there, his head turned toward the house, watching the window of the sick room with those deep, ancient eyes.
What are you at?
She whispered, stepping out into the biting air. Storm didn't move as she approached him. He didn't even flinch when she came within a few feet.
I'm doing my best.
she said, her voice rising with a sudden, sharp anger.
I'm trying to keep the fire lit and the medicine coming, and you're standing out here like a ghost, making everything harder than it needs to be. I need you to run, Storm, do you understand? I need you to be more than what you think you are.
Storm flicked an ear, but otherwise remained as still as a grave marker.
I need you,
she said, her voice dropping to a broken whisper.
I can't do it alone anymore.
For a fleeting second, it felt as though the air around them softened. It felt like he might step forward and lay his head on her shoulder. Instead, he turned away with a slow motion. He walked back toward the shed, lowered his head to the meager pile of hay, and ignored her completely. Betty stood alone in the dark yard, the total weight of the day, the chemist's cruelty, the neighbor's indifference, her mother's rattle, pressing down on her all at once.
Fine,
she said, her voice wavering.
Be a statue then. See if the crows care.
The next morning broke with the promise of more rain. Betty didn't wait for the sun. She went straight to the shed, her jaw set in a hard, determined line. Storm looked up as she entered, a piece of straw hanging from his mouth.
We are doing this today,
she said, her voice like iron.
I'm not asking you, and I'm not pleading with you.
She grabbed the brush and worked with an aggressive speed. Then she brought the heavy saddle over. Storm, sensing her mood, stepped sideways to avoid the leather. Betty moved with him, blocking his path with her own body.
No, not today.
He moved again, his muscles rippling under his black coat. She moved again, her eyes fixed on his.
I said no.
Storm tossed his head, a warning, but Betty didn't flinch. She reached for the girth strap, pulled it tight with every ounce of strength she possessed, and set the saddle firm.
Now enough of your nonsense,
she hissed. She hauled herself up, but the moment her weight hit the stirrup, Storm reared. It wasn't a playful leap, it was a powerful, violent surge. Betty clung to the mane, her heart in her throat.
Steady, steady, you brute.
He came down hard, his front hooves striking the packed earth with a sound like a hammer.
Go on,
she said, her breath sharp and hot.
Move.
He didn't move. He stood and braced himself. She urged him again, digging her heels in with more force than she had ever used. But nothing. Her temper finally snapped.
Move,
she shouted, a scream of pure, unadulterated frustration, giving him a sharper kick. Storm didn't walk. He surged forward in a chaotic burst of energy, then stopped dead. Then he surged again, bucking sideways toward the stone wall. Betty lost her balance as the world tilted. She hit the ground with a hard bang, the air driven violently from her chest. For a terrifying second, she couldn't draw a breath. The world spun in shades of grey and brown, and Luna began to bark wildly, a high-pitched sound. Storm stood a few feet away, looking down at her, his chest heaving. Betty rolled onto her side, coughing and gasping for air. Mud soaked into her thin clothes, and her shoulder throbbed with a dull, pulsing heat.
Grand,
she rasped, the world tasting of dirt.
That's just grand.
She pushed herself up, limbs shaking. She climbed back into the saddle, and again he threw her, and again, and again. Each fall left her slower to rise, her body a map of bruises and scrapes. By the 5th time she hit the mud, she didn't get back up. She simply sank into the muck, her head bowed, her arms shaking so violently she had to wrap them around her knees to keep them still. Her face was streaked with dirt and hot, bitter tears she hadn't meant to let fall.
I can't do this,
she said, the words breaking loose at last.
I can't do all of it. I'm just one girl.
Storm stood a few paces away, his black coat shimmering with sweat. Betty wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a long smear of dark mud across her cheek.
She's getting worse, Storm,
she said, her voice a broken whisper.
The medicine's nearly gone, I've no more eggs to sell and no more potatoes to dig. I've nothing left. And I thought when I found you that maybe you were the answer. I thought you might help us."
The yard fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Only the sound of the wind through the eaves remained. Storm looked at her. For the first time, his gaze didn't seem distant. He looked at her, then he turned his head and looked toward the farmhouse, toward the small, dark window of the room where Fay Langan lay. He stood like that for a long moment, as if he were listening to the sound of the coughing from within. Then he looked back at Betty. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully, his massive head lowered until his soft muzzle touched her mud-stained shoulder. It was a gentle nudge. Betty didn't move at first. She was too stunned by the contact. He nudged her again, more insistently this time, blowing a warm, hay-scented breath against her neck. Slowly and painfully, Betty pushed herself to her feet. Her joints screamed in protest.
"Are you done throwing me in the dirt, are you?"
she asked, her voice trembling. Storm stood perfectly still. He didn't move a muscle as she placed her muddy foot into the stirrup and climbed up one last time.
"Walk on,"
she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Storm moved. It wasn't the reluctant, dragging walk of the previous days. It was a smooth, purposeful stride. They crossed the yard together, passing through the gate and out onto the path. Luna ran alongside them, her tail held high, barking with a new joy. Betty let out a long, shuddering breath.
"There now,"
she whispered.
"we're moving."
The days that followed were different. They weren't easy. Nothing on that farm would ever be easy, but the resistance was gone. They worked in the open fields first, Storm learning the nuances of her voice, and Betty learning the immense power hidden within his frame. There were stumbles and moments where the old stubbornness flickered in his eyes, but he never threw her again, not once. They moved from a walk to a slow trot, from the yard to the winding path, and finally to the open stretches of the common land. Betty laughed for the first time in months when he picked up speed without being asked, the wind whipping her hair back until she felt like she was flying.
"That's it, Storm, that's it,"
she cried, her heart soaring. Each day, the bond between the girl and the fairy horse grew. It wasn't a perfect thing, but it was real, forged in the mud and the desperation of the hill. On the morning of the qualifiers, before the sun had even touched the horizon, Betty sat beside her mother one last time. Fay was asleep, her face pale and sunken, but the fever had eased enough that her breathing was quiet. Betty reached out and squeezed her hand.
"I'm going today, Ma," she whispered. "Just for the qualifier. I won't be long."
Fay didn't wake, but her fingers seemed to twitch in response. Betty stood, pulled on her tattered coat, and stepped outside. Storm was waiting by the gate, his black coat groomed until it shone like silk. The racing track was a hive of activity when they arrived. There were more people than Betty had ever seen, rich men in carriages, farmers in carts, and riders of every description. The air smelled of horseflesh, tobacco, and excitement. And, inevitably, the laughter. It started before she had even reached the rail.
"Well, if it isn't the Queen of the Bog and her Snore of Tara,"
a voice called out. Betty clenched her jaw. Morris Gill stood with a group of wealthy lads near the starting area. Winter's Flame was beside him, looking sleek, fast, and arrogant.
"Thought you'd be staying at home to dig more dirt, Betty,"
Morris shouted, his friends erupting into snickers. Betty said nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on the track ahead.
"Give us a yawn, will ya?"
another voice shouted.
"I need a nap."
The name Snore of Tara spread through the crowd like a wildfire. People pointed and laughed at the massive, somber black horse and the girl in the muddy shawl. Betty felt the sting of it, a hot flush of shame, but she didn't let her shoulders slump. She guided Storm toward the starting line, her hands steady on the reins.
"Pay them no mind, Storm,"
she murmured into his ear.
They don't know who you are.
Storm flicked an ear, his eyes fixed on the open stretch of dirt ahead. The race was called. The riders took their places, the tension in the air rising until it felt like a physical weight. Betty settled into the saddle, heart pounding nervously.
Just run, she whispered, leaning over his neck. That's all I ask of you. Just run.
The signal was given. The start was absolute chaos. Horses surged forward in a wall of muscle and thunder, hooves tearing into the dry track and throwing clouds of dust into the air. Riders shouted, whips cracked, and the noise was deafening. Storm started slow, heart-breakingly slow. The other horses leaped ahead, leaving them in a cloud of grit. Betty's heart dropped into her boots.
Come on, Storm, please.
For a terrifying moment, nothing changed. They were at the back of the pack, the laughter of the crowd rising in her ears. Then, something shifted. It wasn't speed, not at first. It was a change in the way Storm held himself. His head lifted, his ears pinned back. His stride began to lengthen, growing deeper with more rhythm. He moved, not with the wild, desperate energy of the other horses, but with a steady, deliberate power that seemed to come from the earth itself. They passed one horse, then another. Betty leaned forward, her face pressed near his mane, her voice a constant hum of encouragement.
That's it, lad. Go on. Show them what you can do.
The noise of the crowd began to blur into a dull roar. The track stretched out ahead of them, a stretch of brown against the green. Storm kept going, his pace increasing with every stride. He wasn't running against the other horses, he was running through them. Somehow, through no single moment of effort, but a gradual, unstoppable momentum, they found themselves moving toward the front. By the final turn, Betty could hardly believe her eyes. The copper of winter's flame was just a few lengths ahead.
Keep going, Storm. Keep going,
she cried, her voice lost in the wind. Storm did. He surged past the chestnut mare in the final 100 yards, his hooves sounding like a drumbeat. They crossed the finish line first. A sudden heavy silence fell over the crowd for a heartbeat. Then the noise broke, not into cheering, but into confused, buzzing whispers. Morris Gill rode up beside her a moment later, his face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage.
That was luck, Betty Langan, he spat. A fluke of the wind, nothing more.
Betty's hands were trembling so hard she could barely hold the reins, but she looked him straight in the eye.
Maybe it was,
she said, her voice steady.
But a win's a win.
Morris shook his head, his lip curling.
Don't get used to the feeling. The final's next week, and the real riders will be there. And let's not forget I won last year, which entitles me to a slot in the final. I'm just chalking these races up to practice.
He turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust. Betty looked down at Storm. His sides were rising and falling in deep, powerful draws, but he stood strong, his head held high. She pressed her forehead briefly against the wet silk of his neck.
Good boy, she whispered. You did it. You really did it.
As she led him back toward the road home, the distant thunder rolled once more over the hill of Tara, and this time it sounded like a cheer. The win in the qualifier didn't change what people thought of Betty Langan. It didn't scrub the mud from her boots or the poverty from her name. Instead, it merely changed how often they spoke about it, turning a girl they usually ignored into a brief, flickering source of amusement. For a day or two, the village of Screen carried a certain buzz. It wasn't admiration, and it certainly wasn't respect. It was something closer to the curiosity one feels when watching a stray dog perform a trick it shouldn't know. At the well, on the road, and outside the grocer's shop, the whispers followed her like the hum of summer flies.
Did you hear about the Langan girl?
The one with the great black beast of a horse.
Snore of Tara, they're calling it now. I heard it barely woke up until the final furlong. Sure, there's always a fluke in those qualifiers. A bit of luck with the wind and a stumble from a better horse, and suddenly everyone thinks they found a champion.
Betty heard it all. She heard it while she was hauling water and while she was bartering for a bag of oats. She kept her head down, her jaw set, and carried on. There wasn't much time to be bothered by the wagging tongues of people who had never known the weight of a dying farm. At the farmhouse, the atmosphere had shifted into something almost hopeful. Faye had improved, just slightly. The fever had finally broken the morning after the race, leaving her skin pale and clammy, but her mind clear. She could sit up now for short stretches, propped against the pillows, and she could speak without the terrifying shallow gasp that had categorized her every word for weeks. It should have felt like a weight lifted. It did, in a way, but Betty knew better than to trust a temporary reprieve. The medicine bottle was a hollow shell once more, and she knew with a grim certainty that without the full course, the fever would return as soon as the rains moved back in from the coast. It always did. "You look tired, love," Faye said one morning. The sun was tracing a line across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. "I'm not tired, Ma. I'm just busy." "You say that every day. Better to be busy than to be bored." Faye smiled, the skin crinkling around her eyes. "You went to the track," she said, her voice a soft rasp. "I heard the dog barking when you came back. You haven't told me how it went." "So you knew I went," Betty said. "I thought you were sleeping and too sick to know." "Mother's intuition, love. And I have eyes. I see that fine horse outside through the window." Betty paused, her hand stalling on the cloth she was folding, and she said, "Well, I won the qualifier." Faye lay there stunned for a second, and then she said, You won, Betty? Truly? We came in first." There was a long, heavy silence, then Faye laughed, a soft, dry sound that turned into a brief cough before she could catch it. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, her eyes shining with a sudden fierce pride. "You always said you'd find a way. You were always the one for grand ideas. Well done, love. I'm so proud of you." Betty sat down on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's hand. "There's a bigger race, Ma, in a few days, the Meath Championship. There's prize money, enough to take you to the clinic in Navan, enough to fix the thatch and buy the winter grain, enough so I don't have to count the drops in the bottle anymore." Faye's fingers squeezed Betty's hand, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman so diminished. "Love, you do so much and you worry so much. You're too young for a burden like this." "Ma, you're not a burden," Betty said, softly. "You never are, and you never will be." Faye smiled, looked at her daughter in the eyes, pulled her in close, and kissed her lovingly on the forehead. It was nice to lay there for the few hours in the afternoon, just holding each other as a mother and daughter should, letting the time pass and forgetting the world for a time. Later that afternoon, Betty rode Storm into the village to formally register for the championship. The horse moved well beneath her now. He wasn't polished like the thoroughbreds from the estates. He didn't have the prancing grace of a show horse, but he was ready. There was a power in his stride that felt like the beating of a drum. The village went quiet as they passed. People noticed. They always noticed the girl on the shadow horse. "Here she comes, look it," a man whispered from the doorway of the forge. "Snore of Tara," a boy yelled from an upstairs window, followed by a peal of mocking laughter. The name followed her like a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples of derision reaching her wherever she went. Betty ignored it, keeping her eyes fixed between Storm's ears. She dismounted near the small, temporary office by the track entrance where the clerk was taking entries. The man inside was hunched over a heavy ledger, his spectacles sliding down his nose. "Name?" he asked, his pen poised. "Betty Langan." He paused, the scratching of the nib stopping. He glanced up, squinting at her. "You're the one from the qualifier, the one who came out of nowhere." Yes, I am." He looked past her, through the open door, to where Storm was waiting. The horse was perfectly still, his black coat absorbing the afternoon light. "That horse yours? Properly yours now, I mean." "Yeah, he's mine." The clerk made a small wet sound with his tongue, a noise somewhere between skepticism and outright dismissal. Name of the animal? Betty didn't hesitate. Storm of Tara. A voice drifted in from the doorway behind her, sharp and familiar.
Snore of Tara, more like.
Laughter rose from a group of men lingering outside. Betty didn't turn around. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing the anger in her eyes. The man at the desk smirked slightly as he dipped his pen into the inkwell. Storm of Tara, he repeated, writing the words in looping dismissive script. You'll be running the full championship course, 4 miles across the common and the main stretch. It's a long race for a horse that looks like a plough puller.
I know the distance.
It's a grueling run. Most of the local stock won't finish the 3rd mile.
Well, we'll finish,
Betty said. He shrugged, blotted the ink, and waved her off as if she were a nuisance. Betty took the entry paper, her fingers brushing the rough parchment, and stepped back out into the bright, judgmental daylight. Morris Gill was standing a short distance away, surrounded by his usual circle of sycophants. Winter's Flame stood beside him, her chestnut coat gleaming as usual.
Are you looking forward to the weekend, Betty?
He called out, his voice dripping with false concern. Betty mounted Storm without a word, her movements practiced and swift.
You'll want to get that saddle checked, Langan,
Morris added, his eyes dropping to the cracked leather of her father's old seat.
It'd be a shame if the strap snapped while you were busy taking a nap in the middle of the field.
Betty glanced down at the gear, then back at him.
It's fine. If you say so, but it's a long way down from a horse that big.
There was something in his tone, an edge of malice, that lingered in the air long after she turned Storm toward home. There was a sense of unease, but she shoved it down. She had more important things to worry about than the taunts of a boy with too much silk and too little heart. That evening, the atmosphere turned heavy. The clouds gathered low and purple over the hill of Tara, pressing the remaining light into a dull purple grey. The wind had dropped to nothing, leaving the fields in an eerie, unnatural silence. Betty stood in the yard, a brush in her hand, working the tangles out of Storm's mane. The horse was restless, his skin twitching, as if he could feel a storm brewing that he couldn't see.
I hate to say this, Storm, but as well as we did at the qualifier, we're going to have to be better next time,
she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness.
No standing about like a statue at the start line. No deciding halfway through the 3-mile mark that you've had enough. Can we agree to do that? Can we try?
Storm let out a low sigh, a warm gust against her arm.
It's just, this is the only chance we have. If we lose this, I don't know what happens to Ma.
He flicked an ear toward her.
I know you understand, she said. You've got a fire in you. I saw that on the track. They all saw it.
Luna lay stretched out near the kitchen door, but she wasn't sleeping. Her ears were up, and her gaze was set on the dark, ragged line of trees that bordered the farm. Suddenly, a sound drifted through the air. It began soft, a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It grew clearer, a voice, deep, resonant, and cold. Where's he hiding? Betty went absolutely still, the brush slipping from her fingers. Storm's entire body tensed. Then the voice came again, echoing off the walls of the cottage. Where's that wretched broken nag? Betty stepped back slowly, fearing the worst.
No, it can't be him,
she whispered, her eyes darting to the woods. Storm lifted his head high, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. He let out a low, uneasy whinny.
Come on, Storm,
Betty whispered, being careful not to be heard. She grabbed his lead rope and began to pull him toward the safety of the shed.
Inside, come on quickly before he sees you.
Storm resisted for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the shadows, but Betty's desperation seemed to reach him.
Please,
she choked out.
If he sees you, he'll want you back.
He moved then, allowing her to lead him into the cramped, dark interior of the shed. She threw the heavy wooden bar across the door, her hands shaking so much she had to use her shoulder to force it into the notch. Luna was on her feet, a low, savage growl rumbling in her chest. Her hackles were raised in a jagged line along her spine. The voice was at the gate. "I know you're here. You can't hide from the king of the road." The mist had followed the voice. It crept low across the yard, curling around the legs of the bench and through the spokes of the old cart, a thick, unnatural fog that smelled of ancient death. Betty moved back toward the house. A shape moved within the mist. It was tall, draped in a coat of endless black that seemed to drink what little light remained in the sky, and the Doulahan stepped into the yard. He moved with a slow, terrifying grace, a long whip of bone hanging from his hand. In his other hand, he held his head. The dead eyes in the severed face burned with a faint, malevolent glow as they scanned the yard. "You've taken what's mine, mortal," the head said, his voice vibrating in the very air Betty breathed. Betty forced herself to stay upright, though her knees felt like water.
"He came to me," she shouted, her voice trembling. "He was bleeding and broken, and you left him." "He belongs to the road," the head replied. "He belongs to me." "He doesn't want to. He's found a home here." The Doulahan took a heavy step forward, the mist swirling around his boots. "What a creature wants has no bearing on what a creature must do. He was bred for the crossing. He was bred for the shadow." Betty shook her head in panic. "You cast him out. You called him a useless nag. You gave up your right to him the moment you struck him with that bloody whip." "I cast him down to test his mettle," the head corrected, his burning eyes fixing on Betty. "I am his master. I can punish him however I see fit, and a servant must endure." Another step. The cold radiating from the figure was so intense that Betty's breath began to fog in front of her face. "A steed doesn't choose its rider, peasant," the head went on. "It serves the purpose for which it is made. It serves or it dies." Storm suddenly kicked hard against the inside of the shed door. The wood groaned and shuddered under the impact of his massive hooves. "Storm, don't!" Betty screamed, her eyes darting between the shed and the spectre in the yard. The Doulahan moved with a speed that defied his size. He crossed the yard and struck the shed door with his whip. The sound was like a thunderclap. The wooden bar didn't just break, it shattered into splinters. The door swung open on its rusted hinges, crashing against the stone wall. Storm burst out into the yard, and for a terrifying moment, the horse and the rideless horror stood face to face in the swirling mist. Betty ran toward the horse. "Storm, please, go back inside." The Doulahan stepped between them. His presence was a wall of absolute cold. "It's done," the head said. Storm stopped. He didn't rear, he didn't fight. His whole body began to tremble in a way that looked like fear but felt like something deeper, a resignation. "Come on," the Doulahan commanded, the word of physical weight. Storm didn't move. He looked at Betty, his large dark eyes filled with a profound, silent apology. "Come on," I said. The Doulahan barked again, raising his whip in warning. Storm took a step toward him. Betty felt something in her chest break. "No," she whispered. "Storm, please, don't go back to the dark. Stay with us." He didn't stop. He walked right up to the dark figure. The Doulahan reached out with his free hand and took the loose end of the lead rope. The figure turned, and the horse followed, his head hanging low, his spirit seemingly extinguished. "Storm," Betty called out, her voice a broken sob. The horse didn't look back. He walked with the slow gait of a funeral procession. The mist rose up to meet them, and within seconds, both the horse and the headless rider were gone. The yard was empty, save for the splinters of the door and the silence of the hills. The next morning felt hollow. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. The yard was a ruin. The shed stood open, the interior looking small and pathetic without the massive presence of the horse.
The lead rope lay on the ground, snapped clean near the end as if it had been bitten through by iron. Betty stood in the doorway for a long time, her eyes red and her heart a heavy lump of lead. Luna sat beside her, her head resting on Betty's knee, unusually quiet and still. "He's gone, Luna," Betty said. "The rider took him back." She went inside to check on her mother. Faye was awake, watching the door. "You're up early, Betty," she said softly. Betty nodded, forced herself to move. "I might go down to the track, if that's okay." Faye studied her daughter's face, her own expression clouding with concern. "You don't sound yourself, love. What's up?" "I'm fine, Ma. I just wouldn't mind some air." "Will you bring Storm with you?" Faye said. "Yeah, maybe. We'll see." Betty walked out through the kitchen door with her head down. Faye watched her go. Then she looked out through the window and she saw the splinters of wood laying across the ground. It didn't take much for her to figure out what had happened, but all she could think about was the broken heart of her child. It was championship day at the track. The place was alive with energy. By the time Betty arrived on foot, the track had drawn people from 3 counties. Betty stood near the edge of the fence, just another nameless face in the throng. She watched the riders preparing their mounts. She watched Morris Gill as he was helped into his saddle by a groom. He looked like a king in his fine silks, and Winter's Flame looked like a goddess of fire. "Did you lose something, Langan?" Morris called out when he spotted her standing alone by the rail, his eyes scanning the empty space beside her. Betty didn't have the words or the energy to answer. "Looks like you did," he said, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "I told you not to get used to the feeling of winning. Some people are born for the track, and some are born for the ditch. It seems your Storm finally found his way back to the mud." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby crowd. Betty stared at the track, the brown dirt blurring in her vision. "It's a pity," Morris added, adjusting his gloves. "I would have liked to see Snore of Tara try his luck on a real course. It would have made for fine comedy." He turned his horse toward the start line, but then his expression shifted. The grin faltered, replaced by a look of confusion that deepened into shock. "Well, love, what in the name of God?" Betty turned, and from the far edge of the woods, near the ancient boundary of the Tara Hill, a dark shape broke into the open. It galloped, a wild, thundering pace that seemed to shake the earth. A horse, running free. Storm of Tara. The lead rope was still there, but it was frayed and broken, trailing behind him like a banner of war. He didn't slow down as he reached the track. He headed straight for the rail, straight for the girl in the muddy shawl. Betty's heart leapt so violently it made her gasp for air. "Storm!" she cried, her voice cracking. He came to a sliding halt beside her, his breath coming in great, steaming plumes. His nostrils flared as he gently nudged her shoulder. His coat was covered in forest debris and the pale mist of the road, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, independent light. Then Betty noticed the emerald on his chest was gone, and a bruise where it once rested, like something had snatched it off him, or, worse, taken it back. "Your gem, what happened? Did he take it back from you?" She noticed something in the horse then, the way it wouldn't meet her eye. There was something in that one faint gesture that cast a deep worry into her heart. But then he nudged her again gently with his nose, as if to reassure her that everything would be all right. Betty looked toward the trees, half expecting the headless rider to emerge from the shadows. "He'll come looking for you, Storm. He won't let this go. But I'm so glad you're back. Whatever about this race, I'm just so glad to see you again." In that moment, horse and girl gently touched foreheads. The race horn sounded in the distance, a deep, resonant sound that felt like a challenge. Storm tossed his head, his mane flying. He didn't look like a servant anymore. He looked like a king. The official's voice boomed over the crowd, calling for the riders to take their places for the main event. Betty looked at the track, then at Storm, then at the distant silent hills of her home. She saw in her mind the sight of her mother's pale face, and then she felt the heat of the horse's skin under her hand. She didn't have a groom, she didn't have silks, she didn't even have a whole lead rope, but she had the horse. "All right," she said, her voice turning to iron as she gripped the saddle. "Let's finish this, once and for all." As she hauled herself into the seat, a low, ominous roll of thunder echoed from the direction of Tara, but this time Betty didn't flinch. She knew that the storm could very well have been on her side. The track fell quiet in the way it hadn't all morning. It wasn't the silence of an empty field, but that peculiar heavy hush that spreads through a massive crowd when something impossible steps into the light. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath all at once, unsure if they were looking at a miracle or a mirage. Storm of Tara stood beside Betty, his massive obsidian sides heaving with the exertion of his run from the woods. The broken lead rope trailed from his neck like a tattered ribbon of silk, a remnant of a dark master he'd finally, irrevocably defied. He didn't look like a farm horse anymore. He looked like something forged in a furnace and quenched in the blackest waters of the Boyne. Morris Gill stared from atop Winter's flame. "Well, isn't that a disappointment? I thought he'd done a bloody runner on you." Betty didn't answer. She didn't even look his way. "I admire the desperation, truly, but a strange black horse won't save you from a real thoroughbred." Betty scowled at him, her eyes as cold as the mist. "If I have a horse, I'll ride it, and if I'm riding, you'd best be looking at my back." The official's voice boomed over the field. "Riders to the line, 4 miles, the Meath Championship." Betty guided Storm forward. The distance ahead of them was daunting. 4 miles of grueling terrain, sharp bends that punished the reckless, and long, agonizing stretches that broke the spirits of lesser animals. This wasn't a sprint. It was a war of attrition. She leaned low over Storm's neck, her fingers entwined in his thick mane. "Just run," she whispered. "Don't think about it. Just run like you're wild and free." The signal horn blasted, a sharp, brassy note that ignited the air. The race began with a chaotic rush that took Betty's breath away. There was no settling into a pace, no cautious feeling out of the competition. The field of 20 horses surged forward as one, a thundering wall of muscle and bone. Hooves struck the earth with the force of hammers, throwing clods of turf as large as fists into the air. The noise was a physical thing, a roar of wind, shouting men, and the terrifying beat of 80 hooves. Storm didn't hang back. He didn't wait for the mid-race slump. He moved with the pack, his stride long and powerful. He wasn't leading, but he wasn't trailing either. He held his position in the middle of the thundering herd, his eyes fixed on the path ahead with a terrifying focus. Betty kept her hands like stone on the reins. "That's it, lad. Hold the line. Save the fire." They took the first bend at a terrifying tilt. The thin gap opened between a grey mare and a bay stallion, and Storm slipped through it with the precision of a hawk. Betty felt the change then, the same ancient, quiet focus settling into him. He wasn't breathing like a normal horse. It was a deep, resonant sound, like a bellows in a forge. They gained ground. One horse dropped behind, its rider cursing as the animal's lungs began to fail. Then another fell back. The crowd noise became a blurred smear of sound as they passed the first mile marker. "Go on, girl, keep 'em moving," a voice cried from the rail. Betty didn't look. She saw only the ears of her horse and the copper flicker of Winter's flame ahead. Morris was already near the front, his horse running with grace that was beautiful to behold. She was fast, she was light, and she was pulling away. The second mile arrived, and the pace began to take its toll. This was the graveyard of the weak. Horses that had been pushed too hard at the start began to falter. Small stumbles turned into dangerous lurches. Betty saw a rider go down to her left, the man disappearing into the grass as the horse's legs gave out. Storm held his own. He was a machine of black muscle, his hooves striking the ground with an unbreakable cadence. But he didn't surge. He stayed exactly where he was, a shadow following the leaders.
Come on, Storm,
Betty urged, her voice lost in the wind.
You've got it in you. I know you do.
It happened just past the halfway mark, near a dip in the ground where the mud was thickest. It was a small thing, a slight shift of the leather beneath her thigh, and sudden, sickening looseness. The girth strap, weakened by age and pushed beyond its limit by the violence of the gallop, finally gave way. The saddle slipped, one side dropped. Betty's balance vanished in an instant. She grabbed for the mane, for the reins, for anything to stay upright.
Storm!
The saddle turned completely, dragging her sideways. She hit the ground with a bone-shattering impact. The world rang like a struck bell. Pain flared in her hip and shoulder, and for a second the sky turned black. Storm stumbled as the weight left him, his rhythm broken. Behind him, a rider veered wide, his horse screaming as it narrowly avoided trampling Betty. The pack thundered past, a blur of brown and grey, leaving her in a cloud of dust and silence. Betty pushed herself up, gasping for air. Her chest felt as though it were filled with broken glass. Storm stood 10 paces ahead, his head down. He tried to take a step toward her, and Betty's heart shattered. His front leg lifted slightly. He was favouring it. He was limping.
Oh no,
she whispered, scrambling through the dirt toward him.
No, Storm. Storm, are you all right?
She reached him, her hands trembling as they moved over his back and shoulder. The heat coming off him was immense.
The strap broke. Oh my God, you're hurt.
She pressed her forehead against his wet skin, the tears finally spilling over.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You've done enough. You've done more than anyone could ask. We tried, Storm. We tried.
The race powered on. The leaders were already half a mile away, their figures shrinking into the distance. The crowd's attention had moved with them. Betty Langan and her black horse were yesterday's news, a footnote in a race they were never meant to win. In that moment, Betty let herself feel the full, crushing weight of the loss. She saw the empty medicine bottle in her mind. She saw the hole in the thatch. She saw the future vanishing like the mist. Storm nudged her. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a hard, insistent shove that nearly knocked her over. She pulled back, wiping her eyes.
What? Storm, look at your leg. We can't.
He nudged her again, nostrils flaring. He lowered his front quarters slightly, a clear, undeniable invitation.
No,
Betty said, her voice cracking.
You'll break yourself for good. I won't let you do that for a purse of gold.
Storm stamped his good leg against the ground, a sound like a crack of thunder. He turned his head, looking down the long stretch of the track at the fading horses, then back at her. His eyes weren't dark anymore. They were beginning to glow with a deep, smouldering ember light. He was defiant. He was refusing to lose.
Storm,
Betty said, as the fire in his eyes cast an orange glow across her face.
What's happening?
The horse kicked the ground again, insistent.
It's 4 miles, Storm,
she whispered.
We have 2 miles of ground to make up on a broken leg.
He snorted, a sharp, metallic sound. He didn't care about the odds. The moment stretched, the wind whistling through the grass. Then a sound rose above the distant roar of the crowd, a voice, thin and reedy, but carried by the spirits of the hill.
Betty!
Betty turned her head. At the very edge of the track, near the starting rail, 2 neighbours were supporting a thin, trembling figure between them. It was Faye. Her mother had dragged herself from the sickbed, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her face as white as the moon. She was standing on the very ground she had been too weak to walk on for months. She raised a shaking hand, her voice cutting through the air like a silver bell.
You can do this, Betty Langan. Don't you dare look back. Go on, Storm of Tara.
That name rang out across the field. Storm of Tara. And then the impossible happened. A few voices in the crowd near the rail picked it up. Then a few more. Storm of Tara, look. She's getting back on. Storm of Tara.
Storm of Tara.
Storm of Tara. The mockery was gone. The amusement was gone. It was replaced by a raw, visceral hunger for a miracle. Betty felt the change in the air. She felt the ancient energy of the hill of Tara rising up through the soles of her boots.
Okay,
she said, her voice turning to iron.
Let's finish this, one way or another.
She didn't reach for the broken saddle. She left it in the dirt. She grabbed Storm's mane and hauled herself onto his bare back. Her weight was centered, her legs gripping his powerful ribs.
Easy now,
she whispered.
One step at a time.
Storm stepped forward. The limp was there, a jarring, painful hitch in his gait. He groaned with the effort, but he didn't stop. He took another step, and they began to move. The race was far ahead, almost out of sight. It was a lost cause by every law of man and nature, but Storm ignored the laws. The trot became a run. The run became a gallop. The limp didn't vanish, but it was buried under a surging, unnatural power. Betty felt a heat beginning to radiate from the horse's spine, a warmth that seeped into her legs and chased away the pain of her fall.
Storm,
she said, her eyes widening. His ears pinned back against his skull. His stride lengthened until it felt as though they were leaping across the world. The ground began to blur. The air itself seemed to thin out, turning into a rushing tunnel of green. Then his eyes flared. They weren't embers anymore. They were twin suns of burning, terrible red.
Storm!
The mark on his hind leg, the pale spiral, began to glow with a blinding orange light, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, as his hooves struck the earth, a flicker of flame erupted from the dirt. It wasn't a fire that burned in the grass. It was a fire of pure spirit, burning from the hooves themselves. The crowd fell into a stunned, absolute silence as the black horse and the girl without a saddle tore past the 3-mile marker. They weren't running, they were hunting. One horse passed, then another. They were moving at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a living creature. 6th place, 5th, 4th. The leaders were finally back in view. Morris Gill was in the lead, his whip cracking as he urged Winter's flame toward the finish. He was 50 yards from glory. He was certain of his victory. Then the sound of a drum, a heavy beat that shook the very air in his lungs. He glanced back, his eyes bulging. Storm of Tara was closing the gap like a thunderbolt.
What the hell?
Morris screamed, his face contorting.
Get away from me!
He lashed his horse, but Winter's flame had nothing left to give. She was a champion, but she was mortal. Storm was something else. Neck and neck, stride for stride. The final 100 yards were a blur of fire and fury. The heat coming off Storm was so intense that Betty could feel her hair singeing, but she didn't let go. She leaned into the heat, her voice a primal scream of triumph.
Go on, Storm, go on.
They crossed the finish line in a spray of dirt and light. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then the judge's voice cracked over the roar of the crowd. Storm of Tara, the winner is Storm of Tara. The crowd erupted into a sound so loud it seemed to shake the clouds. It wasn't just a cheer, it was an acknowledgement of something ancient returning to the land. Betty clung to Storm's neck, her breath coming in sobs.
You did it, you beautiful, stubborn brute.
The celebration was a blur of hands, voices, and tears. Someone, she didn't see who, pressed a heavy leather purse into her hand. 50 pounds. The weight of it was the weight of her mother's life, of a warm house, of a future. She found Faye in the crowd, the woman weeping with a joy that seemed to have cured her more than any medicine ever could. They held each other, the girl in the muddy clothes and the mother who'd found her strength, but then the heat began to fade. Betty felt a sudden sharp coldness in the air. She turned, looking for Storm. He wasn't standing among the cheering crowd. He was walking away. His head was low, moving toward the dark line of the trees at the edge of the field. Storm! She pushed through the throng, ignoring the calls of the officials. Storm, wait! She caught up to him as he reached the shadows of the oaks. He stumbled, his legs buckling. He collapsed onto the soft grass, his breath coming in shallow, whistling gasps. Betty dropped to her knees beside him, pulling his massive head into her lap. No, stay with me. We won, Storm. We have the money. Mam'll be fixed, and you'll be staying with us, okay? Do you understand? Storm's eyes were fading, the red light cooling into a dull, peaceful grey. He looked into her eyes with a profound, weary certainty, and she looked back at him, and then down at the place where the emerald once sat, the very life that the Dullahan had taken away. And she understood then, his words echoing in her mind. There's a cost for a horse that denies its master. Storm had used every ounce of magic that kept him in this world to win that race. He burned his own essence to save her. I'm so sorry, Betty whispered, her tears falling onto his velvet nose. I never meant for this to be the end. I would have stayed in the ditch if I'd known. Storm gave one last deep sigh, a breath that smelled of summer hay and ancient hills. He nudged her hand one final time, a gesture of absolute, unconditional choice. Then he went, still. Betty bent over him, her grief breaking through quiet, shaking sobs. Luna came beside her, resting her head on Storm's flank, a silent vigil for a fallen king. A shadow fell over them. Betty looked up, her eyes blurred with tears. At the edge of the trees, the Dullahan stood. He wasn't moving. He didn't have his whip raised. The head in his hand watched the scene with a look that wasn't anger and it wasn't triumph. It was something perhaps closer to respect. The riderless horror turned and vanished into the mist of the woods, leaving the girl and her horse alone. They buried Snore of Tara at the very edge of the farm, overlooking the hill where he'd first appeared. Betty marked the spot with a single heavy stone from the boundary wall. She carved the name herself, her hands steady. Snore of Tara. Weeks passed. The money paid for the clinic, for the new thatch, and for a winter that didn't feel like a death sentence. Faye grew stronger with every passing day, the colour returning to her cheeks and the laughter returning to her voice. One afternoon, when the light was soft and gold over the fields of Meath, Betty returned to the grave. She knelt in the long grass, feeling the peace of the land. You were never an ag, Storm, she said quietly. Not for one single second. The wind moved through the trees, a gentle, hushing sound. I don't know where you came from, or what the road is like where you are now, she went on. But I know what you chose to be. You chose to be ours. She placed her hand on the cold stone. I'll never forget you, Storm. Not ever. She stood up to leave, turning back toward the house, but as she took a step, the ground beneath her feet trembled. There was a slight vibration, the ghost of a hoofbeat. She turned back to the grave, and hanging from the stone now was a bronze necklace with the emerald stone. From the top of the hill of Tara, a mile away, a whinny rang out, strong, clear, and full of a wild, unbreakable joy. Betty looked up, and on the distant rise, a massive black shape stood against the setting sun. It reared up, its mane flying like a banner of smoke. It looked whole, it looked powerful, it looked free. Then, with a final thundering gallop, it turned and disappeared into the golden light of the horizon. Betty stood still for a long time, a small, knowing smile finally touching her lips. Some things in this world are measured in years, and some things are measured in the weight of a choice. Storm of Tara hadn't stayed, but he'd changed the world before he left. And as the stars began to blink awake over the ancient hills, Betty Langan walked home, knowing that some ghosts don't come to haunt you. Some come to set you free. The fire's gone to ash now, and the night has grown long. That's all from our little fireside this evening. If you found a bit of company in the shadows of this story, I'd be very grateful if you'd let me know. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and perhaps share a thought in the comments. I read them all, and they keep the fire burning. Until the next time the wind calls us back to the road, take care of yourselves.